The unlikely candidate. The Cambridge Academy of Vocal Arts stood like a fortress of prestige against the crisp Boston morning sky. Its red brick walls had witnessed decades of musical excellence, and today, they would witness something extraordinary. Emma Reynolds slipped through the heavy oak doors, her worn leather folder clutched against her chest. Unlike the other candidates who strutted in designer suits and carried expensive briefcases, Emma wore a simple gray dress that seemed to have seen better days. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a modest bun, secured with a plain elastic band rather than the elegant accessories the others sported. The audition hall buzzed with nervous energy. Aspiring vocal instructors sat in clusters, their resumes thick with accomplishments from prestigious institutions. Emma took a seat in the back row, trying to ignore the whispers that followed her entrance. "Who's she supposed to be?" one woman in a tailored blazer murmured to her companion. "Probably got lost looking for the community center," came the snide reply, followed by poorly concealed laughter. Emma kept her expression neutral. She had expected this reaction, it was precisely why she had come dressed this way. After years of being America's most celebrated young opera star, she craved something genuine, a position earned on merit alone, not reputation. At the front of the room, Professor Richard Harmon commanded attention from behind the grand piano. His silver hair and impeccable dark suit projected authority, while his sharp eyes surveyed the candidates like a hawk evaluating prey. Two other committee members flanked him, and a small group of the Academy's star students sat off to the side, permitted to observe the selection of their potential new instructor. "Ladies and gentlemen," Professor Harmon's voice cut through the chatter, "welcome to Cambridge Academy auditions. Today, we seek not just talent, but excellence. We seek not just teachers, but mentors worthy of our exceptional students." Emma's heart raced as she watched the first candidate approach the piano with confidence that bordered on arrogance. "Vanessa Cartwright," the woman announced, extending her impressive resume like a shield. "Eastman School of Music, 5 years with Chicago Lyric Opera." Professor Harmon barely glanced at the credentials before nodding dismissively. "Let's hear what you've got." As Vanessa launched into Puccini's "O mio babbino caro," Emma studied the professor's reactions. He was demanding, stopping candidates mid-performance to correct technique or question their interpretation. One by one, accomplished singers took their turn, each bringing medals, degrees, and glowing recommendations. Emma's folder, containing only sheet music, suddenly felt impossibly light. When the morning session concluded, she remained in her seat, watching the other candidates network and compare credentials. Some cast curious glances her way, but none approached. She was the outsider, the question mark in a room full of established answers. As the afternoon session was about to begin, Emma made her final decision. She would go through with her plan, consequences be damned. Sometimes the greatest teachers weren't those with the most impressive resumes, but those with the deepest understanding of what it meant to truly serve the music. Little did anyone in that room know that they were about to witness something that would change everything they thought they knew about talent, judgment, and the power of music to reveal truth. The challenge. "Emma Reynolds," Professor Harmon called, his voice carrying a note of barely concealed impatience as he checked his watch. The afternoon had grown long, and his tolerance for what he perceived as mediocrity had worn thin. Emma stood gracefully, smoothing her simple dress as she walked toward the piano. The room fell silent, all eyes tracking her movement. She could feel the weight of their judgment, the assumptions being made about her modest appearance and unknown background. "Your resume, Miss Reynolds." Professor Harmon extended his hand expectantly, his fingers drumming impatiently on the piano's polished surface. "I haven't brought one, sir," Emma replied, her voice steady despite the thundering of her heart. "I'd prefer to be evaluated solely on what I can demonstrate today." A collective gasp rippled through the room. The other candidates exchanged incredulous glances, while the student observers leaned forward with sudden interest. Professor Harmon's eyebrows disappeared beneath his silver hairline. "I see," he said, drawing out the words with theatrical emphasis. "How unconventional. And where exactly did you study, Miss Reynolds?" "Here and there," Emma replied vaguely. It wasn't technically a lie. She had studied at the Curtis Institute before her meteoric rise, followed by private coaching with masters across Europe. But those credentials belonged to a different version of herself, one she had deliberately left at the door. Dr. Abernathy, the woman seated to Professor Harmon's right, didn't bother hiding her disdain. "This is the Cambridge Academy, not a community talent show," she muttered, just loud enough for Emma to hear. "Perhaps you're unaware," Professor Harmon continued, his tone becoming increasingly condescending, "but we're selecting instructors for exceptionally gifted students. Our faculty must have impeccable credentials and extensive experience." The students in the corner watched with wide eyes, sensing the building tension. One boy whispered to his friend, earning a sharp shoo from their chaperone. "I understand," Emma said, maintaining her composure. "I believe I can offer valuable instruction regardless of my background." Professor Harmon's mouth twitched into what might have been a smile if it had contained any warmth. "And what will you perform for us today?" Emma carefully placed her sheet music on the piano stand. "I'd like to perform Pamina's aria from Mozart's The Magic Flute." Professor Harmon sniffed dismissively. "Rather safe, isn't it? Almost a student piece." He glanced at his colleagues with an expression that clearly said, "This is exactly what I expected." Emma held his gaze steadily. "It's emotionally complex and requires—" "Indeed," he interrupted, his tone making it clear he found her choice uninspiring. His fingers hovered over the keys, then abruptly closed her music. "Actually, I think not." Emma blinked, the only outward sign of her surprise. "If you wish to instruct at this academy, Miss Reynolds," Professor Harmon continued, a challenging glint entering his eye, "you should demonstrate true technical mastery." He reached into his own folder and extracted a different score, placing it deliberately before her with the ceremony of a judge delivering a sentence. Emma glanced down at the music and felt her pulse quicken. Der Holly Rake, the Queen of the Night's second aria from The Magic Flute. The piece was notorious among sopranos for its punishing difficulty, requiring extraordinary range, precision, and breath control. It was an aria that could make or break careers. "Unless, of course, it's beyond your capabilities," Professor Harmon added, his tone making it abundantly clear that he expected her to back down, to admit defeat and slink away in embarrassment. Behind him, one of the committee members shifted uncomfortably. "Richard, that's hardly fair as an audition piece without preparation." "On the contrary," Professor Harmon interrupted, his eyes never leaving Emma's face. "Any qualified vocal instructor should be able to handle standard repertoire. Our students certainly are expected to rise to challenges." In the corner, a girl with glasses whispered urgently to her classmate, "That's the hardest aria in the soprano repertoire. It's basically impossible without extensive preparation." Emma absorbed the tension in the room, the expectation of her failure hanging like a thick fog. She recognized this moment for what it truly was, not just a challenge, but a deliberate attempt to publicly humiliate her for the presumption of applying without the proper credentials. Professor Harmon smiled thinly, his victory already assured in his mind. "Well, Miss Reynolds, shall we proceed, or would you prefer something more attainable?" Emma took a slow, centered breath, the kind she had perfected during countless performances on the world's greatest stages. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had sung this very aria hundreds of times at the Metropolitan Opera, at La Scala, at the Vienna State Opera. She had recorded it for her Grammy-winning album just 3 years ago. "This will be fine, thank you," she said, meeting his gaze with a newfound determination that caused his confident smile to falter slightly. As Professor Harmon turned to the keys, his fingers poised over the opening notes, Emma felt the weight of her decision settle over her. There would be no hiding after this moment. The truth would emerge in the most dramatic way possible. The distinctive, ominous introduction began, and Emma closed her eyes briefly, centering herself. Around her, the room grew still with anticipation, some eager to witness her failure, others anxious on her behalf, none suspecting what was about to unfold. The revelation. As the opening notes of the Queen of the Night aria filled the audition hall, Emma felt a familiar transformation begin. Her posture subtly shifted, muscle memory taking over as years of professional training aligned her body for optimal performance. Her ribcage expanded with the deep, controlled breath of a seasoned performer, invisible to the untrained eye but immediately recognizable to professionals. Professor Harmon noticed. His fingers faltered almost imperceptibly on the keys, and a slight furrow appeared between his brows as he observed the change in her bearing. Emma's decision crystallized in that moment. She would sing not as Emma Reynolds the incognito applicant, nor as Emma Reynolds the opera star, but simply as a musician who loved this art form enough to teach it with complete integrity. The first challenging coloratura passage approached, a series of lightning-fast runs that separated skilled sopranos from truly exceptional ones. Around her, the atmosphere shifted from dismissive to attentive. Dr. Abernathy leaned forward slightly. The students had stopped whispering entirely. Emma held back initially, not yet revealing her full capacity. Even so, her first note emerged perfectly pitched and controlled, filling the audition hall with unexpected resonance that seemed to vibrate in the very walls of the prestigious institution. Professor Harmon's head snapped up, his fingers continuing mechanically while his eyes fixed on Emma with dawning surprise. The committee members exchanged glances of confusion as condescension gave way to curiosity. The young student sat transfixed, some with mouths slightly agape. The girl who had offered Emma an encouraging smile earlier now leaned forward, her expression transforming into one of wonder. As Emma progressed through the opening phrases, her technique remained flawless despite her apparent restraint. But as she approached the aria's first truly punishing passage, one of the most challenging sequences in all of opera, she made a split-second decision. She would no longer hold back. Meeting Professor Harmon's increasingly bewildered gaze directly, Emma took a deeper breath and opened her voice fully. What emerged was nothing short of miraculous. The aria erupted from her with a power and precision that seemed to defy physics. Her voice soared through the demanding coloratura passages with an ease that spoke of years of professional mastery. Each note was perfectly placed, each run executed with crystalline clarity that filled every corner of the hall. Professor Harmon's mouth fell open. His fingers moved mechanically over the keys, but his shock was evident in his widened eyes and rigid posture. Dr. Abernathy gripped her chair, her earlier disdain replaced by complete bewilderment. The students were on the edges of their seats. Several had tears in their eyes as they witnessed something they had only heard in recordings of the world's greatest opera houses. Emma's voice climbed to the aria's notorious high F, holding it with a strength and purity that made the very air seem to shimmer. The note rang out like a bell, perfect and unwavering, demonstrating not just technical mastery but the kind of artistic interpretation that could only come from years of performing this role at the highest levels. As she descended into the aria's final, vengeful passages, Emma's voice carried not just the queen of the night's fury, but her own quiet triumph. Every phrase was a revelation, every note a testament to the dangerous game of judging others by their appearance. The piano accompaniment had become almost secondary to the voice that now commanded the room with absolute authority. Professor Harmon played as if in a trance, his earlier confidence completely shattered by the reality unfolding before him. When Emma reached the aria's climactic final passages, her voice rang out with such power and precision that several students gasped audibly. She was not just singing the Queen of the Night, she was inhabiting the role with the kind of artistry that defined careers and left audiences speechless. The last note hung in the air like a challenge, perfect and unwavering, before fading into a silence so complete it seemed to press against the walls of the audition hall. Emma lowered her arms and stood quietly, her chest rising and falling with controlled breaths as she waited for the shock to settle over the room like dust after an explosion. Professor Harmon's hands had frozen above the keys. His face had gone pale, and his earlier smugness had been replaced by something approaching panic as the implications of what he had just witnessed began to sink in. The silence stretched on, pregnant with the weight of revelation and the sudden, terrible understanding that everything they thought they knew about the woman in the simple gray dress had been spectacularly, irrevocably wrong. The recognition. The silence that followed Emma's performance was deafening. It stretched for what felt like an eternity, heavy with the weight of shock and dawning recognition. Professor Harmon sat frozen at the piano, his hands still hovering over the keys as if he couldn't quite believe what had just transpired. Finally, one of the students in the corner broke the spell. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying clearly in the absolute quiet. That's Emma Reynolds. The Emma Reynolds." The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Heads turned, eyes widened, and suddenly everyone was looking at Emma with new understanding. The girl with glasses pulled out her phone with trembling fingers, quickly searching for images that confirmed what their ears had already told them. "The Metropolitan Opera star," another student breathed. "She won the Grammy 3 years ago for her Queen of the Night recording." Dr. Abernathy's face had gone ashen. She stared at Emma as if seeing a ghost, her earlier condescension replaced by mortification. The other committee members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the full weight of their collective judgment crashing down upon them. Professor Harmon finally found his voice, though it came out as little more than a croak. "Miss Reynolds. We had no idea." "No," Emma said quietly, her voice still carrying the power that had just filled the hall, "you didn't." And that was precisely the point. She moved away from the piano with the same quiet dignity she had shown throughout the ordeal, but now her presence seemed to fill the room in a way it hadn't before. The simple gray dress that had marked her as an outsider now seemed like a masterclass in confidence, the choice of someone so secure in her abilities that she needed no external validation. "I came here," Emma continued, her blue eyes sweeping across the faces that had mocked her just minutes before, "because I wanted to see if the Cambridge Academy valued talent over reputation, substance over appearance. I wanted to discover if this institution was truly about nurturing excellence or simply about maintaining an exclusive club." The students watched in rapt attention, witnessing a lesson in humility that they would remember for the rest of their lives. Several were recording with their phones now, capturing what would undoubtedly become a viral moment. Professor Harmon struggled to compose himself, his professional facade crumbling. "Miss Reynolds, please forgive our misunderstanding. Obviously, your credentials speak for themselves. The position is yours, of course. We would be honored." "No," Emma interrupted gently but firmly. "I'm afraid it's not that simple." The professor's face paled further. I don't understand." Emma looked around the room, taking in the faces of the other candidates who had whispered about her, the committee members who had dismissed her, and finally, the students whose education hung in the balance. "Teaching isn't about what you've accomplished," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned hard truths through experience. "It's about recognizing potential wherever it appears, regardless of packaging. It's about nurturing talent even when it doesn't fit your preconceived notions." She picked up her simple leather folder from the piano. "A true educator sees beyond the surface, listens before judging, and creates an environment where all students can flourish, not just those who already fit the mold." The room had fallen completely silent again, but this time it was the silence of people absorbing a profound lesson rather than recovering from shock. "You asked me to prove my capabilities," Emma continued, meeting Professor Harmon's eyes directly. "But the real test today wasn't of my ability to sing. It was of your ability to recognize excellence when it doesn't come wrapped in the expected package." One of the students, the girl who had offered Emma the encouraging smile earlier, raised her hand tentatively. "Miss Reynolds. Does this mean you won't be teaching here?" Emma's expression softened as she looked at the young faces turned toward her with hope and admiration. These students deserved better than an institution that valued appearances over substance. "That," Emma said with a smile that held both sadness and possibility, "remains to be seen. Sometimes the greatest lessons come from the most unexpected places, and I suspect today has taught all of us something valuable about the danger of assumptions." She moved toward the door, leaving a room full of people to contemplate the magnitude of their misjudgment and the rare opportunity they might have just lost forever. The transformation. As Emma reached the audition hall doors, Professor Harmon's voice stopped her. "Miss Reynolds, please wait." She turned to see him standing at the piano, his earlier arrogance completely gone. The man who had tried to humiliate her now looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of his own actions. "You're absolutely right," he said, his voice carrying across the silent room. "About everything. I made assumptions that were not only wrong but fundamentally opposed to what education should represent." The other committee members nodded in agreement, their faces showing genuine remorse. Dr. Abernathy stepped forward, her earlier disdain replaced by something approaching shame. "Miss Reynolds, we owe you more than an apology," she said. "We owe you our gratitude for teaching us something we should have learned long ago." Emma studied their faces, seeing genuine regret rather than mere embarrassment at being caught. The students watched the exchange with wide eyes, witnessing their professor's public acknowledgement of their failure. "The question is," Emma said quietly, "what will you do with this lesson?" Professor Harmon looked around the room at the other candidates, many of whom had been equally quick to judge Emma based on her appearance. Several looked ashamed, while others seemed to be having revelations of their own. "Change," he said simply. "Starting with how we conduct these auditions. Starting with how we teach our students to evaluate talent. Starting with remembering that music, true music, comes from the soul, not from a resume." One of the students, a young man with earnest eyes, raised his hand. "Professor Harmon. If Miss Reynolds agrees to teach here, could she teach us about performing without pretense? About finding authenticity in our art?" Emma felt her heart stir. This was why she had come, why she had endured the mockery and judgment. These young artists needed to learn that greatness often came disguised as simplicity, that the most profound truths were often found in the most unexpected places. "I'll consider it," Emma said, "on one condition." The room held its collective breath. "Future auditions will be conducted with the candidates behind the screen, just like symphony orchestras have done for decades. Let the voice speak first, let the talent reveal itself before assumptions can take root." Professor Harmon nodded emphatically. "Agreed. Absolutely agreed." Emma looked at the faces around her, the humbled professors, the aspiring teachers who had learned a valuable lesson about judgment, and most importantly, the students whose education would be shaped by this moment. "Then yes," she said with a smile. "I'll accept the position. But not because of my credentials or my reputation. I'll accept it because this institution has shown it's capable of growth, of learning from its mistakes, and of becoming what it should have been all along." The room erupted in applause, led by the students whose enthusiasm was infectious. Professor Harmon approached Emma with genuine warmth, extending his hand. "Thank you," he said. "For the lesson, for the humility, and for giving us a chance to be better." As Emma shook his hand, she felt the satisfaction of knowing that her unconventional audition had accomplished something far more valuable than securing a job. It had opened eyes, changed perspectives, and created an opportunity for growth that would benefit generations of students to come. The girl who had smiled encouragingly at Emma approached shyly. "Miss Reynolds. Thank you for showing us that it's okay to be different, that talent doesn't have to look like what everyone expects." Emma squeezed the girl's hand gently. "Remember that lesson, dear one. The world needs artists who are brave enough to be themselves, who aren't afraid to surprise people with their authenticity." As the afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of the Cambridge Academy, Emma Reynolds, no longer disguised but finally revealed, looked around at the faces of those who would become her colleagues and students. She had come seeking a teaching position, but she had found something much more valuable, the opportunity to transform an institution and inspire a new generation of artists to look beyond appearances and listen with their hearts. The simple gray dress that had marked her as an outsider now seemed like a symbol of possibility, proof that greatness could come from anywhere, in any form, if only people were wise enough to recognize it. The end.